All right, welcome back, everyone. I apologize about that issue with Zoom. What we're going to be covering today is going to be authentication. So in today's lesson, we'll be talking about the different types of authentication, creating a user model, dropping the database and recreating our database, and we'll see why we need to do that. Then we'll talk about Django REST framework token authentication. We'll create the views for register, log in, and log out for our application. And we'll create a view so that a client can get info about themselves. After that, we'll cover how to handle the super user, since after we create our own user, we won't be able to create a super user through the terminal. At this point, does anyone have any questions over the topics that we'll be covering today? All right, if there aren't any questions, let's go ahead and go into the different types of authentication. So for authentication, we have three separate types. We have basic authentication. And in basic authentication, essentially what happens is every time that request is sent, that HTTP request is sent by a client, inside of the authorization headers, they have to specify, hey, this is a basic type of authentication. So their first keyword within that authorization header will be basic. And their second keyword or following keywords will be their password. So what do I mean by that? We've been working with Thunder Client quite a bit. If I were to take a look at the different things that we have here, we can go to API/v1/Pokemon. And if we were to send this request, we know that it would receive all of our Pokemon. Let's try to run our server. Our server's running. We send that request, and there you go. We have all of our Pokemon. But if we have some sort of authentication, how would our user pass this authentication to us? Well, now we're going to go into the headers tab. And here in the headers tab, we can see a couple of things relating to who's sending this request. The Thunder client is sending this request. And this is some sort of thing to say, hey, accept my calls regardless of what framework you're currently working in. But we can add a header named authorization. And inside of this authorization header, if we're doing basic authorization, the first keyword would be basic, followed by my username. And then after that, it would be followed by my password. And I believe it would look something like this. So there's how the request would get sent, right? If we were to look at this as an Axios equivalent, let me see if I could make a quick JavaScript file here. All right, so if I were to make an Axios equivalent, it would be something along the lines of axios.get. It would follow the same API endpoint. And rather than specifying my body automatically, I would go ahead and specify headers. And inside of those headers, I would have an authorization header, where my first keyword will be basic, followed by username and password. So that's what it would look like through Axios as far as sending a request with authorization. And that's what we're doing here with our Thunder client. Now, there's a couple of problems with this. Every time this request is sent, our users essentially exposing their credentials over and over and over again, right? It's not nested within the body. It's right at the headers level. So anytime this request is sent over HTTP or HTTPS, those credentials are being exposed, which isn't very safe. And it's likely not the best way to conduct authorization. And that's pretty much it for basic authentication. Does anyone have any questions regarding basic authentication? All right, the second kind of authentication is a session-based authentication. Now, a session-based authentication, I wouldn't be able to demonstrate through this project here, because we would have to essentially create a full stack application through the server. Now, a session authentication is where everything lives on the server side, and there is a cookie that is given to our front end or the template that is being rendered by our backend framework to authenticate a specific user. And while that user is within the session, it will continue utilizing that cookie to confirm the session and then confirm the user that has currently been logged in until they log out. And once they log out, then their session would be terminated and that cookie would then go away. We can't necessarily demonstrate it because we didn't go into Django templates during this cohort. But if you would like to take a look at how to do that, we can definitely provide some documentation or some previous lessons as to how you can create Django templates, have Django render HTML files for you, and how you can handle authentication through Django. Does anyone have any questions regarding session-based authentication? Go ahead, Liz.
Session-based authentication, especially for like bigger stuff, like whenever you log into like any modern like web app and it uses like hey login via like Google or GitHub or anything else like that. When you log into like Google, for example, and it like utilizes a token still, but it saves your session for like X amount of days so the token expires. Is that just like a combination of session and token authentication, or is it a separate thing?
Yeah, for that, they're definitely using a combination of a session and also a token-based authentication. You could kind of combine them. It's how do I go about explaining it? The short answer is yes. I could give you a further explanation later on, but I'm trying to avoid going down a rabbit hole in this case.
If it's okay with you, I'll give it to you later. I've been working with Django templates for like personal stuff.
Okay, awesome. All right, and then the last form of authentication, which is what we're going to be utilizing today, is going to be token authentication. So in token authentication, what we're going to do is we're going to generate a token for each individual user and expect that user to pass that token over to us. Now that token, just like the password of a super user, is going to be hashed, meaning that it's going to be a series of a string of numbers and letters and something going on in the back end as far as how it's being interpreted or unhashed is matching the token to a user within our database. Well, how does that look like whenever I'm sending requests here? Well, when I'm sending requests here, all I'm doing is saying token, because I am passing a token, and then my token would actually go within the authorization headers. Now, this is usually the preferred way as far as to do authentication when it comes to APIs. You want to give yourself some sort of token, and that token is what authenticates our user. They just have to make sure they send that token throughout the authorization headers every single time they make a request, which is easier to do with Axios. Later on in Axios, rather than creating everything this way, what we're going to do is we are going to access Axios dot default dot headers, and I think it's common and then headers. I apologize for not knowing this off the top of my head. But inside of Axios and inside of these many objects that are nested within Axios, we can go ahead and give an authorization key. And inside of that authorization key, we would pass the token along with the token information. And let me actually bring back what we had before. And paste that after. Which is going to be a bit of a cleaner way to just set the token once into Axios, and then that way we don't have to specify it within every request. All right. So let's take a look at how this works or how we can implement this within Django. Again, we're going to be utilizing token-based authentication, and we'll be utilizing Django REST framework. So if we take a look at Django REST framework, they have a whole section over authentication. Here they have some API references, and they even have some third-party packages that you can utilize. Something that's also really useful that you may want to look into are JSON web tokens. It's a completely different extension, and it's an extension for the Django REST framework. You'll have to install it in addition to Django REST framework, and it walks you through the process on how to actually be able to implement it. But so we could fully understand how this authentication works, we're going to go into our token-based authentication. Well, if you read through the documentation as far as how authentication is authorized within Django REST frameworks, it breaks it down for you for how it determines authentication. It gives you a couple of different options. So it tells you that if it can't find something, it's going to return an anonymous user. And here's the part that where we really want to pay attention to. So now we want to specify that we want to utilize one specific type of authentication. And here it gives me two examples. It gives me REST framework authentication, basic authentication, REST framework authentication, session-based authentication. Now, it doesn't include token-based authentication, but we can follow the same pattern to actually implement token-based authentication. So if we scroll down to our settings.py, I'm going to go ahead and close my Pokemon app, go into my settings.py, and come down here to the bottom. I like to do it right after this list of dictionary section. That way all of my list of dictionaries are in the same spot. And there it is. So now I'm saying, hey, in REST framework, these are the authentication methods that I'm going to allow. But I do not want to allow for session-based authentication, and I do not want to allow for basic authentication. Instead, I'm going to specify that I want to utilize the token authentication. All right. So again, this is going to set the authentication method globally. It's saying that, hey, if anything requires authentication, it should be through token-based authentication. Does anyone have any questions as to why we're implementing this REST framework, the default authentication classes to be token authentication? All right, there aren't any questions. So let's go ahead and move into our token authentication. If I wanted to authenticate a user, well, there's two things that I need, right? I need one, a user, not the default user. And I also need a token from REST framework. Well, how do I bring these two in? Well, first I want to cover tokens and how we bring in tokens. As I previously mentioned, tokens are going to live within our database. They're actually going to be created and saved within our database. And Django REST framework and Django will work together to confirm that each individual token matches a user with a one-to-one relationship. Well, how do we bring that in? After bringing in REST framework, I'm going to add REST framework dot auth token. And this is going to bring in the auth token app. Now, what exactly does that mean? I have an app named auth token. Currently, I haven't made any changes in any of my models. But if I run Python manage py, make migrations. Oh, REST framework. Oh, forgot a comma. Oh, is that what you were trying to tell me, Jens? I think so. All right. So now if I run make migrations, it gives me no migrations detected. Good. That's what I expected. Right? There's nothing that has changed. But if I run migrate, well, now I have a couple of new models that were migrated into my database. We can see that it happened at auth token 001 initial. We got auth token 002, 003, and 004. Well, what exactly is going on here? I'm going to go ahead and say PSQL. Ooh, was it Pokey API underscore DB? It was. All right. And then I'm just going to take a look at my list here. Well, if I take a look at my list here, and I open this up. Oh, that was the wrong one. I have my authorization group with an authorization group sequence. But now I see I have this auth token down below. That's a table. I have a permission sequence, so I can set permissions to these users as well. But what's happening in auth token? Let's check that out. Let's say select all from auth token. Well, we can see that token has a key, a created value, and a user. So there's that model. And we're going to see it in Python code here shortly. But I just created a new model. I didn't create it myself. It came from REST framework for an authorization token that lives inside of my database and has a one-to-one relationship to my user. Does anyone have any questions over how to import tokens from Django REST framework? All right. It doesn't seem like there are any questions. Let me see if I could find this import statement here. Token authentication. So here we are. If we walk through the token authentication portion in REST framework, it tells you how to do it. You must add it into your installed apps. And then it walks you through how to actually create this token for a user. Well, the next portion is creating a user model. We don't want a user to just be the same user that we have within Django. We want our user to have some of the same capabilities, but also give us the ability to change some of its attributes. So we're going to go ahead and knock into our Django server here. I'm going to run Python manage py start app user app. We can see this user app has now been created. I'm going to go into the models portion and I want to create a user. Now, this user, as I mentioned earlier, I want to have some of the same attributes as the Django authentication that their default user already has. So I don't have to make this user from scratch. I could utilize inheritance to borrow some of this information that this user already has and change some attributes so that it fits the what I wanted the polymorphism. So how do I do this? Well, one, I need to bring in the model that Django is using for authentication. And that's not living within models. If I go into Django.contrib.auth.models, that is what's going to give me access to all of the different models. So here we can see they have different permission managers. They have groups of permissions. There's their user manager with a bunch of methods. And this is the one that we're going to use the most. We're going to utilize the AbstractUser. So the AbstractUser base class, let me clean this up. Base class implementing a fully featured user model with admin compliant permissions. Username and password are required. Other fields are optional. Great. So that gives me all of the information I really need. I need to be able to access the admin site as a super user, so that's fantastic. Here's the username validator, which gives you the validation as well. Let me open this on a different one. So It looks like it accepts everything to include special characters, one or more instances, and I'm not sure what this \Z here means. But if I try to enter anything other than that, it's going to tell me this value may contain only letters, numbers, and oh, it doesn't allow for special characters. I apologize. I read that regex from them. All right. So it gives me my validation as far as how this model is working, tells me my username model. And this gives me all the information that I need to actually create my user. All right. I'm not going to make any of this from scratch. I'm going to borrow it all from what's already built in from Django and change some of its attributes. So I'm going to go ahead and import AbstractUser and create my class for a trainer. Now, I mentioned earlier, I want to utilize inheritance. So how could I utilize inheritance within this model? Go ahead, Brian.
Between the parentheses, you can put abstract user.
Perfect. Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and place AbstractUser, and that's what actually gives me the inherited values for the abstracted key. I am going to write an email field here that I'm going to reinforce by models.email field. And I want to make sure that this is unique. And actually, before I even type that out, I'm just going to pass it this way, and then we'll go over why I want it to be unique. Well, I'm going to make a username field here. And that username field, I want it to be my email. Now, if I'm utilizing my email as my username, then I need to ensure that the email field will always be unique. So no user has the same email as any other user. And then the final argument that we need is required fields. And I'm just going to pass in an empty list. So this is saying I want to utilize all of my fields as required fields. If I only wanted to make a couple of them, I would specify in this list. The reason why that abstract user model says that the only field that's necessary is username and password is because all of my other fields have some sort of default value already provided to them, or they accept something like blank. This is saying I cannot create a user unless the specific attributes within this list are implemented when I go to create a user. And that is it as far as creating my trainer model. Does anyone have any questions regarding the trainer model? How it's working, how it's utilizing inheritance, and how we went about building it out. Go ahead, Jens.
Does this give every user admin permissions? Was there a way to limit their permissions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this does give our user many admin permissions, right? So we can see, oh, actually it doesn't. We can see here that is staff is set to false for default, but maybe we can actually put that in there as well. Let's see, date joined, object. So that is staff is what gives them access to the admin site. I wonder if we could change that some way every time a user is created. We'll handle that portion in the views as far as making sure that this is staff comes out to be false every single time. But yes, currently the user does have administration permissions. We ourselves would have to limit that, limit their permissions, because currently they do have admin compliant permissions. Go ahead. I think that's Terrence.
Yeah, sorry, just for clarification, in the required fields, do we actually put the values of that information, or do we list out the fields that are required there?
Yeah, we would actually put out the fields that we want to required. So for example, if I wanted to make sure that email was included in here, I could place it in there. If I wanted to make sure that is staff was passed within the request, I could do that as well. But currently I don't want any other than the ones that I have here. to be required. So when we go to create an email, it's going to tell us, hey, the email field is required. But it's not telling us that the email field is required because of this empty list. It's telling us that the email field is required because we have a, excuse me, everyone. Sorry, everyone, if I could get 5 seconds.
Terrence, what was, but Francisco can confirm that.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, so as I was saying, we're gonna get an email field is required, but that's not happening because of these required fields. It's happening because here in the model of the abstract user model, it tells us the only 2 things that we need is username and password. And here we're telling it the username field you're gonna be utilizing is email. So if we don't pass an email, it will throw an error. Does that answer your question yet, Terrence?
Yes, thank you.
Of course. All right, I see a question here on the Whiskey Questions channel. What does user group others look like with Django tokens, admin, etc.? User groups and others look like. Could you expand your question a little bit, Michael?
Sorry. Yeah. Yeah, it was just kind of like because Yams was asking about the admin thing, so I was thinking that what does that look like? It's probably something else. I didn't know if they had like an add-in or options or how we kind of implemented that. So kind of just like the admin user kind of setup. I was thinking like user group others, kind of like in Linux commands, like when you give specific authority to like read, write, and execute certain things. So just basically, yeah, those along those lines, if that makes sense, just admin and users and varying permissions. I didn't know if there's a file or how they implement that. That's all.
Yeah, that's a great question. So go into the group here. You can create a group for your different users. We don't cover that, but it looks like you can create a group and it gives you a description as to what that group has. And they have some permissions to be able to edit some stuff if you would like. And then you can also create groups. So here's the group manager, which manages all of the groups. And then there's the groups that you can create. We're not going to be covering that here in this lecture, but you definitely have the capability to utilize these models to create groups and manage them. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's good. And it gives me stuff to look at as well in the future. Thank you.
Of course, no problem. All right. The next thing that we're going to be covering is how do we connect this model to Django? Right? Django needs to know that this is what I want to utilize as my user rather than the default user that's already been built in. So again, I'm going to go over to my settings. And within my settings, I'm going to go ahead and specify to Django that there is a different user model that I wanted to use. So at the very bottom of my authenticate of my settings.py, I'm going to pass in auth user model. And what I want you to use is going to be my trainer app dot, oh, excuse me, my user app dot trainer. All right, so let's make sure that that's correct. So user app dot trainer, that's the trainer model that lives within the user app. And if I go to my installed apps, I messed up and I do not have my user app just yet. All right. So there you go. Everything has been made, should be running now. But there's going to be a bit of an issue. And actually, before we run into said issue, let's go ahead and make some fixtures real quick. All right, so I'm going to create some fixtures that I'm going to indent by 2. The dump data that I want to dump will be from my moves app and my Pokemon apps. So let's go ahead and say move app dot move And I want to dump this into my move app fixtures in my move data.json. Then I want to dump data for my Pokemon itself. So I'm going to say Pokemon app dot Pokemon. And I want to dump this inside of my Pokemon app fixtures Pokemon data. All right, so all of my data has been dumped now. I have made sure that my fixtures are there and that my move app has set fixtures with all of the data that I've created. And that my Pokemon app also has the fixtures with all of the data that I've created so far. Good. So I have all my settings done. I'm going to go ahead and uncomment this information so that I can account for that app. And now I'm going to try to make migrations. So I'm going to say Python, manage PY, make migrations. So it looks like it was able to create my model. And say Python, manage PY, migrate. And when I try to migrate, I get an issue. Now, this issue, it's saying that inside of my Django database migrations, there's something going on with an inconsistent history where admin 001 initial is applied before its dependency user app 001 on database default. Now, when you create a Django project that's going to utilize a model for a user, you want to make sure you create that user and have that user model built out before you make migrations into your database, because they relate to one another. The model for the user needs to have the admin has a dependency upon the user. If the user it starts being made or gets altered later on, that's okay because we're just building on the migration. But admin cannot be executed until the initial execution or the initial migration of the user app. So that's where this error is coming from. So now let's go ahead and try to fix this. I'm going to go ahead and drop the database. So Poke API DB, and I'm going to create the database. Poke API DB. And that's having trouble dropping it because I'm currently within said database. So let's go into Postgres real quick. So that's going to give me my shell back. And now if I go back into Poke API DB and I run /d, we can see that my database is now empty. I have no relationships. Well, let's load it back up again. I'm going to say Python, manage PY, migrate. I don't need to make migrations because all of my migration files have been made. And now everything worked. I have all of my migrations. I'm going to go ahead and load data from my Pokemon data.json. I'm going to go ahead and load data from my move data.json. Looking for load data. I put Pokemon instead of Python. Interesting. All right. And there you go. My database is back up and running. If I run /d here, we can see all of my different groups have been made to include my user app trainer here down below. And if I run select queries, we can see I still have Pikachu, Charizard, and all of the other Pokemon that I've created from my fixtures. All right, we've covered quite a bit. Let's do a quick overview and then go back and see if we have any questions. So what have we done so far? Within settings, we established a Django REST framework default settings. So here we have REST framework, the default authentication classes to be token authentication. We then imported REST framework auth token. We moved into the models for a user app that we just created, where we created the model for trainer and imported the abstract user. We utilize inheritance to borrow all of that information from the abstract user. Ensure there's an email field that we assign as the username. And we say that we have no required fields. All of the required fields are coming, or the reason if you get any sort of this field is required, it's not coming from this model that we've created. It's coming from the abstract user itself. All right. From there, we went over to our Pokemon project. And within our Pokemon project in settings.py, we added the user app. And at the very bottom, we've also added the auth user model and told our Django project, this is the model that you'll utilize for your user settings. We then encountered a problem making migrations. So we went ahead and dropped the database. So here we can see that here is the error from when we tried to make our migration. We dropped the database of Poke API DB and then created said database for the Poke API database. Once that database was dropped, it was completely cleaned out. It had no migration files. So we were able to run Python manage py migrate, applying all initial migrations along with our user model migration. So if we take a look here, let's see if we can find the user migrations. I can't seem to spot my user migrate. Oh, okay, there it is. So if we can see here, we have our user app 001 that gets ran an initial. And then afterwards, our admin site then becomes executed. Well, if we saw earlier in that error, it said it had a dependency upon the user app. And that's why we weren't able to load it into our database because admin was referencing the incorrect user. All right, at this point, does anyone have any questions over anything that we've covered up to this point? All right, I don't see any questions. I do see a question in the chat here. Where it says, I'm trying to follow along upon making migrations and getting errors, class versus framework, auth token admin, model admin must define search fields because it's referenced by token admin autocomplete fields. I need to include an additional field in trainer class. I would have to take a look at your code. I'm not sure where exactly this error is coming from. I don't believe it's coming from your model itself. I think it has something to do with your import statement or your installed app statement regarding REST framework.auth token. All right. Doesn't seem like there are any other questions. So let's move forward with implementing this REST framework with our tokens. Well, we have almost everything we need. Right? We have our token now created. We have our user now created. All of my migrations have been made. Everything is living within my database. But how do I actually implement this token-based authentication? Well, we're going to head over to views, and we're going to start importing everything that we'll need to create API views that will return responses, create users, tokens, and attach that connection. So let's start doing that. We're going to say from .models, I want to import my trainer. From REST framework .views, I want to import API view. From REST framework .response, I would like to import response. And then finally, from REST framework .auth token .models, I would like to import token. So this REST framework.auth token, that's an app that we have already. right? That's what we put under installed apps. What I am telling it to do is access the models file within that app and import the token class. Well, now this is a perfect opportunity to take a look at the token class to see what's actually going on here. So here's our class token. It is a models.model. It has a default authorization token model. And here we can see we have a key, which is a char field, and it's also utilized as a primary key. We have a user, which is a one-to-one relationship to settings.auth user model. Well, let's take a look at our settings here. Well, let me go over to our settings. So that's going to settings, coming down, finding the auth user model, and it's saying that that's what it wants to connect a one-to-one relationship to. Great. So then it connects a one-to-one relationship to it. We can see that we have a related field named auth token. So let's copy that, bring that over to our own model later on. And we can see that it's also referenced to as user. So if I want to access the user from my token, I could utilize .user. And if I want to access the token from my user, I could utilize request.user.auth token, which we'll see here shortly once we actually start working through it. And then we can see a date time field for created that covers when this field or when this token is actually being created. All right. Now, how do I go about generating this information? Well, just like everything else, I want to create a class named register. This class will accept a post method. And I'm going to turn this into an actual API view that will create a user. So here we are, register. Can anybody walk me through how do I make this an API view that will return a response? Go ahead, Lewis.
Sort of the basic stuff like adding API view to the class,
All right, so we have API view.
and then adding request in the next to self.
Nice.
And then now we would want to now we I'm trying to think about what we want to do next. Now we'd have to get the data for like how we want to register them. So like through their email and through their username.
Okay, awesome. So for now, let's return a quick response here of user created. All right, so let's do a little bit of pseudocode. So you said we want to grab data from request. Okay, once I have that data from the request, what would be the next thing that I want to do?
Well, we don't have any like validators like last time, so you probably. I was trying to think because like last time, obviously we had a validator and then we saved it. But this time we probably just want to like put it into our model somehow.
Okay, awesome. So we're gonna say that we're going to attempt to create a user. All right. And let's see. Oh, go ahead, Tom.
Do we want to create a token somehow as well for that user? So like they have like an associated like login token, you know?
Okay, awesome. So then if user is created, we want to create a token with a one-to-one relationship. to said user. All right. So that seems pretty simple, right? There's our 3 steps. And what we would want to return is maybe the user email and their token key. All right. Well, we have our steps. Let's put them into some application. So first things first, we want to grab the data. So I'm going to say that that's going to be a copy of request.data.copy. So that gives me all of the data that's coming in from the request. There's a couple of ways to do this. The way I'm going to do it is where all they have to do is send an email and password. But because they're sending an email and password, I need a username field, right? There are 3 separate fields essentially. I have username, email, and I have password. I didn't make them within my model itself. If I go over to my model, I didn't make them within my model itself. The only one I made was email. But we know that the username field is required, and we know that the password is required by the abstract user. So if all I'm getting in my request is an exact copy of my data, and that request just is only bringing in my email and password, I need to create an entry for username. And I'm going to set that equal to request.data.get email. All right, so this would essentially now be a dictionary that has the key of username with an actual username. It has the key of email, which is the same thing as my username. And it has the key of password, which would be my password. So that is what data is actually equal to. Great. Now I'm going to attempt to create a user with this data. But when I go to attempt to create a user with this data, what I'm going to do is I'm not going to utilize .objects.create. I want to create a user. So it has to be .objects.create user. So I'm going to say new trainer is equal to trainer.objects.create user. Notice it's not a recognized method, but it is a method that belongs to the trainer. And when I go to create this user, well, I'm just going to simply pass in ** data. So I can deconstruct that data dictionary. So what am I doing here? This here is the equivalent of me saying that I want to create a user where username is equal to data.get username. Email is equal to data.get email. I just realized I nested one of my parentheses. And password is equal to data.get password. The only difference between this code that I have here and this code that I have down below is syntax. The same behavior is happening. I'm just utilizing deconstruction to be able to plug each value to its appropriate attribute. All right, so now I created a new user. Well, if that new user was created, as we saw here, then I want to actually create a token. So I'm going to say if user, or sorry, if new trainer. So if that did not come back none, or it did not suffer an error, I'm going to go ahead and say token is equal to token.objects.create. And the only thing that token means is the attribute for a user in which case it will be the trainer. Finally, all I need to do is return a response. So I'll go ahead and indent this and say that the response that I'm going to return is going to be the username email. So I'm going to say user, or in this case, I guess it's trainer. And it's going to have the new trainer dot email field. And then I want to bring in my token. And my token is going to be token dot key. All right, we're not really going to need this documentation for Django REST framework anymore. So I'm going to go ahead and make this a little bigger so that we can see it. All right, so there's all of our information and all the steps that we've implemented thus far to be able to register a user. Does anyone have any questions over the post method or the registration class and how it's working? Go ahead, Brian.
Sir, I know this is a demo, but in practice, would we use a serializer to run the is valid against before serializer.save, even for a new user?
So for this new user attribute here, this create user function has that built into it. Let me see if I can find it. There you go. So create and save a new user. Here normalizes the email field. We can see that global user model. Normalize username, user self.model, username, email, extra fields. Well, here's create user. So we can see there's quite a bit of checking going on in the background. But I wonder, yeah, I think that would be good practice to ensure that we run that is valid. It doesn't seem like it's running it automatically for me or running it for me in the backend framework of it. So yeah, we would probably want to do that. So let's go ahead and say new trainer dot full clean. Well, the problem is that if I run this create user here, when I run this create user, it's going to automatically save it into my database, or it's going not automatically, but the logic says to save it within the database. So this full clean would have to happen prior to that. You may want to create some sort of serializer for a post method for being able to create a user. There's a couple of ways to go about that, but that's not part of the lecture. I'm sure you can validate the data if you do not want to just trust Django to kind of pick up the slack and find the errors here. You definitely can.
Thank you, sir.
Of course, no problem. All right. Awesome. So we've been going on for quite a bit. Oh, go ahead, Natalie.
Sorry, I had to step away for a few minutes, like right before you did this. Did we create a token model? How come token.objects.create is a thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we never created a token model. We actually grabbed that token model from Django REST framework. So right up here, we have REST framework.authToken, which is an app that we installed into installed apps. And we're saying that within this app, we want to access the models file and grab the token model. So Django REST framework is providing us this token model to be able to create tokens for a user. Does that answer?
Thank you so much.
Of
Yeah.
course. All right, it doesn't seem like there are any questions. We've been going on for about an hour now. Let's go ahead and take a 12-minute break, come back at 10:10 and continue on with the lecture. Thank you so much, everyone. All right, welcome back, everyone. So far we've been able to create a view that will potentially create a user. We didn't return a response in case the trainer does fail, but I believe that would cause an error, not actually, and it could return none, but we'll see how this goes. Let's return a response of something went wrong for now. All right, so now we have all this information to be able to create a user, but it's not connected just yet. Well, we've covered connecting URLs already, so I could go over to my URLs within my project. I can now add a new path that will ping API/on/users, and this will include my user app.urls. Now my user app does not have any URLs. I apologize, everyone. There seems to be a hot mic. If you do have a hot mic, please go ahead and address that.
That was me, sorry.
No problem. For my user app, I'm going to go ahead and make a new file named urls.py. Gonna import path from Django and create some URL paths. So here in this path, what I wanted to do, say register. All right. There is a class that I would like it to use, but I'm going to name this register. From .views, I would like to import my register view. And now I can go ahead and say register.asView. And there we go. So what do we just do? We told our Pokemon project that it could account for 127.0.0.1 at port 8000/API/v1/users. From there, we also told it that after users, it can also accept the endpoint of register. And the endpoint of register is what actually drives our registration view. So it knocks into the register class as a view. The register class only accepts a post method, and it will be able to connect to create a trainer. Potentially. We don't know yet. Let's go ahead and run it. There's my server. I'm going to bring up Thunder Client. Place it here on the side. All right, here's my view. I want to go over to users/register. Let's make sure I did that correctly. Again, I'll check my URLs in my project. That is users. And after that, I have register, which adds register to the end. I want to send a post request. And as I mentioned earlier, I just want my email and password within this file. So since I just want email and password, I'm going to go ahead and place it as such. Within the body of my request, there will be a field for email. And there will be a field for password. All right, so there's my user. There are my credentials. And I wonder what happens when I send my post request. Well, when I send my post request, we can see that the post request was created. I have a user that has now been created. And I am returning my trainer email. So there we see the email for the trainer. And we can see that the token has now been provided for said trainer. So now I have a token. I'm able to verify myself. I'm not going to change this information anymore. I'm going to save it for now because I don't have a view to be able to actually get my information, which we'll work on next. But now we can see that I am officially a trainer that's able to work or sign up for my site. Someone can sign up for my site and receive their token. Great. Well, let's clean this up a little bit. So I'm creating a new trainer, but currently my HTTP response was a 200 OK. What should my HTTP response be if I am creating a trainer?
201 created?
Perfect. Yeah, I need to get 201 created. So from REST framework dot status, I'm going to import HTTP 201 created. And I'm just going to go ahead and import for, let's do for 204. And let's grab 400 for a bad request. All right, let's try to break our request method here. I'm going to actually save this here and place it in here so that I have that information for later. But now let's try to break this. What happens if I don't put .com and I just send this FR with the password of FR? It seems like this trainer was also created. Interesting. So it looks like this trainer was created with the email and the email field was validated. I'm surprised that the email field did not throw an error. So this is perfect to go with Brian's question earlier, right? We want to make sure that this data is clean, but for some reason it's able to accept this as an email. Definitely expected that to throw an error, but it worked. All right, let's try to add a series of special characters here. Okay, it seems that also worked. So there's some sort of validation that's not working there. So we want to make sure that that validation is actually being read or running. So this create user object may not be the best way to do this. Maybe we want to utilize something like this. And I'm not sure if this will actually work. So here's the main issue that we're running into, right? Let me go ahead and demonstrate it to give everyone some insight here. So if I go and select all from my user to grab my trainer, we can see that all of our passwords are being hashed. They're not being exposed. But if I utilize this method that I have here to be able to actually create a trainer, I believe this is going to create an error. I don't think there is such a thing as a save user function, but there may be. If I run this request one more time, and let me just make sure that I change my email by 1 character. Okay, seems like I got a validation error, which is good. That's what I expected to see. Let's do fr@gmail.com. So that shouldn't send a validation error anymore. I'm going to send my request. So this was able to work and save my information. But now when I run the select all, if I come down to the bottom, we can see that this password was not hashed. It's actually being exposed within my database. So there's got to be a way to do this. If I don't want to force it, maybe there is such a thing as the save user method. Oh. Give me a second, DJ. All right, go for it, DJ.
What if you ran the create user after checking if the full clean passed?
I'm not sure if it will get me that information. Let's see. You're saying like this?
Well, check for success on full clean if full clean didn't error out.
Let me see what full clean returns. Object has no attribute name, create user. Okay, but let me check my print statement up here. Okay, so it returns none for full clean. Now I wonder what it returns if it does actually break real quick. So let me just send this. Oh, it doesn't seem to actually trigger that print statement. It just raises the error right away, so it doesn't return anything. So it looks like I could do some error handling here rather. So I could do some try, and then if it works, then we want to create the user. And I think I know what you mean. So I trainer dot create user
I was
stuff.
about to say it might be a class method.
Yeah. And we could do a try and accept block. All right, there's a bit of a rabbit hole. I apologize to everyone.
The create user should return the user. So if you wanted, you could maybe grab that and use it in your conditional, depending on how you, or your try accept, depending on how you write it. Oh, though actually, I think I apologize. You're set with it in the try accept. I got confused.
It looks like I may have to import validation error here. Which I can't remember off the top of my head where that's coming from. Let's see, Django dot for dot validators dot exceptions. Nope. There it is.
Nice.
Oh. All right, let's see what happens if I send it now. There it is. Now we got it. So we can see that it raised a validation error. I'm not sure where that print statement there. Oh, I'm printing the e.message stick. And if it did cause a validation error, we're going to return that error. We're going to go ahead and say that the status is HTTP 400 for bad request, saying there was a problem here. And then up here, we'll go ahead and say that the status was HTTP 201 created. All right. Let me go ahead and reiterate what I just did, because I'm pretty sure I was doing a lot of my talking in my head. So we have this copy data, which we're going to set to also an email. That's fine. We're going to create a tentative trainer. This is not actually save into my database. And then after that, I'm going to try to run the full clean method. If the full clean method does not raise an error, I will then set the new trainer to create user, which is a class method. And I will create a token and return my response. If this does raise an error, I will raise the validation error or capture the validation error as an exception and return that in my response along with the bad request. So I believe now, since it's successful, attribute trainer has no attribute create user. Oh, there it is. Go ahead, Tom.
I was gonna say, I think just the objects was missing.
Perfect. All right. So now we got it working correctly. We're doing some error handling to make sure that our data is actually clean, and we're running the full clean method. That was a great call, Brian. Thank you so much. All right. So now we have our post method working. We have all of our information, and we're able to get our token authentication. But how do we go and get our own information or ensure that a user is actually logged in? Well, the next thing we're going to cover is logging in a user. I'm going to say class login. This is also going to be an API view. And it is also only going to accept a post method. that is going to take in self and the request. All right. So now we have self in the request, but how do I actually log in a user? Well, in order to log in a user, I'm going to go ahead and create my data again. So I'm going to grab my data. I'm going to copy it. I will then add a key of email, which will be the same as request.data.get email. And now I have my dictionary completely set up. So I have my email and password. And sorry, this should not be email. This should be username. All right. Well, how do I go and authenticate this information? Right? How do I make sure that this is coming out of the database? Well, I don't want to write some sort of query of get user or select all from user where email is equal to email and password is equal to password. This isn't necessarily what I want to do, but I do want a similar functionality to happen. I want to grab a user by email and password. Well, Django knows that we need to authenticate people, so it gives us the ability to grab users from our database through authentication. We will import authenticate, log in, and log out. All right. We'll go over login and log out later on, but currently we're going to concentrate on the authentication portion. I'm going to go ahead and grab a user or a trainer, do that authenticate function. So this authenticate function takes in two parameters. It wants to know the username and the password that we have. So again, I'm going to go ahead and specify that the username is the same as data.get username. And then I'm going to say that the password is the same as data.get password. All right. And then from there, let's print what comes back from training. I'm going to simply return a response that says login, but I'm not going to actually log in the user just yet. I just want us to see what's going on here and what comes back from this trainer. I got to plug in this view. So I'll go to my Pokemon URLs. So I have my users. That's great. I'll go into my user app URL paths and create one for login. Going to utilize the login view. I'm going to give it a name of login. All right, so there's my login view. Everything has been connected. Let's go ahead and send a request. So I'm pinging this API endpoint, but rather than going to register, I will send it to login. And I'm still going to keep my same email and password. Well, when I send the request, I get login. And if I take a look at my print statement is giving me fra@gmail.com. But is that all it's giving me? Well, let's take a look at our trainer. All right, if we go over to, oh, that ain't it. I apologize. If we go over to our trainer and we take a look at the abstract user, it looks like there's some sort of dunder method that's only returning my user. And I'm going to believe that's going to be in the abstract user. Yeah, there it is. It might be because of the verbose name. I may have to figure out what exactly is causing this. But what we're getting back is the entire user instance. We're getting back the entire user, not just the name of the user. And that's happening through the authenticate function. So the authenticate function is going to take in the username and password. And it's going to simply confirm that that is a valid user within our database and return that user. Now, this user is not logged in yet, and we haven't handled how to log that user in. Well, the next thing we're going to do is handle the token portion, right? So I can say if the trainer does exist, which we just saw a trainer come back, I'm going to make a token. But this user already has a token. So rather than utilizing create token or get a token, I want to do something that returns both values. It will get or create a token where the user is equal to the trainer. So what I'm saying here in SQL is I'm saying select all from token where user is equal to trainer. So that's all that's happening there. I'm grabbing this information, but this get or create function doesn't just return one thing. Let's see if we can see what it returns here. So here we see. So we'll return. Oh no, it doesn't really tell me what it does return inside of the code. But what it returns is it returns one, the object that we're looking for, and two, a Boolean defining whether it created it or if it didn't. If it created it, it will be true. If it did not create it, it will be false. But the first thing that it will always return will be the object. So I'm going to destructure this information. I'm going to say that my token and created is equal to the object or the Boolean variable. So let me go ahead and grab that here, paste that down below. So we can see the token object and whether it was created or if it wasn't created. All right, great. So that's going to return to me my token. Finally, I can return the same response that I did for somebody who signed up. But instead of new trainer, I'm just going to do trainer and return the token key. So now I'm going to send the same request. We still get the same token coming back. We got the same information. I am not creating anything within my database. So I am not going to run a create function. I can run my send request again. I still get back the same token because I'm getting from the database. All right, but this isn't everything that I need, right? Because that's essentially the same thing as my register function. So where's the difference? Well, if I run select all from users and run a limit 1 here, which I think that should work. All right, it looks like that didn't work. If I run a select all from my user apps, we can see this is active function is super user, username, first name, last name, email, their date joined. But there is this last login method here, or this last login field. And if we take a look at all of them, none of them have an entry for last login. Not a single user that we've created has been logged in. Well, that's where the login function comes in. So let's take a look at the login function. Let's see what it needs. So the login function needs the request and it needs the user in order to be able to sign in said user. So now inside of my request here for a login, I'm going to go ahead and say that all I want to do is log in a user. The request will be the same request, and the user will be the trainer. All right. So when I send this request, nothing is going to change within my HTTP response. But now in SQL, if I run select all from user, where email is equal to fra@gmail.com, we can see that only one is returned. But now I have an entry for login. All right, so I see my ID, I have my hashed password, and now for login, I have an entry that is a timestamp. So here I have the date and their actual login info of what time it is that I logged in according to my time zone. So that's what the login function does, and this is how you log in a user. Let's go ahead and do a quick review over what we've covered. We sent the post request, made a copy of said request for the data. We gave that this request the username field for email. We then authenticate a user from our database by matching our email and by matching our username and password. If authenticate method returns a user, we're going to say if the trainer exists. If it is not none, we are going to either get or create a token. I don't really care if it created a token or not. I'm just doing object destructuring here to grab the token itself. After that, I'm going to log in the user by passing into the login function the request and the trainer. And then I'm going to return a response that has the trainer's email along with their token. And I guess we could also do this for the register function. Maybe we want them to log in as soon as they register. So we could also add that in here. That way, anytime a user registers, they are automatically logged in. All right, so that will be specific for creating a user. The one down below will be specific for signing in a user. And if this doesn't work, then what I want to return will be no user matching this credentials. And I'm actually going to grab 404 as well, because I want to return a 404 not found here. All right, so now if I send incorrect credentials and I just send FR, I get no user matching these credentials with a 404 not found. All right, at this point, does anyone have any questions over the login or register methods? All right, it doesn't seem like there are any questions. So I'm going to move in to the info method. And at this point, we've done quite a bit about registering and logging in. But now how do I actually grab my user's info, right? How do I go ahead and, hey, say this person exists. I want you to utilize their token to authenticate them and grab that info. Because currently, if I send a request to any of these, if I utilize something like request.user to try to see what the user of the request is, I get this anonymous user. Why isn't that printing? Let's see. Oh, I gotta put print around there. I apologize. So I'm gonna go ahead and say print. send my request, and it gives me an anonymous user. Well, how do I place the user within the request? Right? What's missing here? Well, now we're going to go over into authenticating our user through the token. So now I'm going to make a new class. This class will be named info. This class is going to be an API view, and the only method it is going to receive is a GET request. It's going to receive self request, and it will return a response of user information. I'm going to go ahead and continuously print request.user when we send these requests here. And now I'm going to go ahead and plug this into my URL patterns. We've seen plugging this into URL patterns before. So I'm just going to jump straight into my URLs, bring in info. I'm going to create a new path. This one will be an empty path that will utilize info as a view with the name info. So now we have this token that I can use. But how do I authenticate myself? Let's run a GET request real quick. Well, if I run a GET request to users, we can see that I'm supposed to receive user information. But when I print my user, I get anonymous. Well, I'm passing in my credentials inside of my body of my request. But what I'm implementing is token-based authentication. So we covered this earlier. I'm going to go ahead and add the authorization method here, because that's what we need according to Django REST frameworks. And then I'm going to specify the token. This is token authorization. That's what I'm going to be used, or authentication, sorry. But now I'm going to add my token into this authorization header. All right, well, now I added it into my authorization header. Everything should work just great. Let's take a look at what happens when I send my request one more time. Well, now when I send my request again, I get fr@fr.com for my user. All right, I'm printing request.user. I'm still getting fr@fr.com. And that's because this is something that I am requiring, or this is something that it specifies. This is the user that's now sending the request. But how is this magic happening, right? Like, what's Django doing in the back end to be able to say, hey, this is an actual user? How is this working? Well, we're going to bring in a couple of things from Django, or for Django REST frameworks, so that we can see what's actually happening within this authentication. So I'm going to say from REST framework dot permissions, I want to import is authenticated. And then from REST framework dot authentication, I want to import token authentication. Now, these two classes don't necessarily tell me anything as of now. But if I go into token authentication actually breaks down how the authentication method works whenever I send a request. So here it tells me there's a token-based authentication. Client should authenticate by passing the token key in the authorization HTTP headers, prepended with the string token. And it gives me an example of what it is that it's expecting. Well, what is it that it's actually doing? Well, here we can see that it establishes a keyword. It has a model for none. And then it has this get model method. Well, this get model method doesn't seem to be called. We can see that it's also utilizing its own authenticate function here. And this part is what actually breaks down what's happening. So this get authorization headers, it's going to go into my actual HTTP request, and it's going to grab the header authorization. Let me go back to my class here. Once it grabs the header named authorization, it's going to bring back the string of token space, and then it's going to have the actual authentication. Well, it's going to split this, and then it's going to say, all right, if there isn't one, or if auth0 lower is not equal to the keyword that we've established, then I'm going to return that there is no user. So this is checking that the first word is token and that it matches the keyword up above. All right. If it's only the length of 1, it's going to say, hey, you didn't provide the correct authentication headers because I'm missing 1, right? There should be 2 in. And if there's more than 2, then it's going to tell me you're giving me too much information. You're not giving me the information that I need. And here it tells me token string should not contain spaces. Okay, great. So now it tells me try, and it's going to try to grab the token. And the token is going to grab index 1, which is the second value being passed, the actual key, and it's going to decode it. From there, it will accept if it did not actually decode it and it failed. It just throws an error and says, hey, this is an invalid token. It's not working. You need to try a different token or grab a new token. But if this does work and the exception does not raise an error, it's going to authenticate the credentials for that one user. Now, authenticate credentials will set a model with this get model method. Once it grabs the user model, because all this is doing is grabbing the user model, it's going to grab the correct user model where we have our one-to-one relationship. All right. And then once we have this one-to-one relationship, we can go ahead and return that one user. And we can see down here, it returns the user and the token. And that's how the magic of authenticating through token-based authentication is happening. It's actually querying our database and matching by the key along with grabbing the correct user. And that's how we get our user back into request.user. Does anyone have any questions over how token authentication is working? How it's being able to grab that token out of the headers and return a user into the .user. Okay, go ahead, Jens.
So not really a direct question about that, but rather for structure purposes, do we want to make a separate app for each one of these views, or just have them all condensed like this?
I would have them condensed since they're all a behavior that belongs to the user model, right? So I would place them all inside of this view. You could have a utilities file within this application, and then that utilities file or utilities directory has different scripts, each one handling one specific view at a time, and then they all get imported. That works as well. But I would definitely have all the views living within the same app. Does that answer your question, Jens?
Yeah, this looks really convenient to have them all here. I was just wondering if I were to look elsewhere, if it would look different.
Yeah, no, definitely. All right. So now that we have our info view, we're able to get our info and grab a specific individual. But this isn't happening because we're forcing authentication for this view, right? This view, whenever being pinged, it's working regardless if I'm an anonymous user or not. If I take off my authorization header and I send it, I still get anonymous user. But it's not returning the correct information. I want them to know, like, hey, the only way that you can ping this API view successfully is by giving me your token. So I have to specify permission classes and authentication classes here within my info view. So I'm going to go ahead and say permission classes. And this is going to take in a list. And this is going to be token authentication, I believe. I may be messing those up. Let me make sure. Now permission is authenticated. I apologize. So this is going to be is authenticated class, which is just saying this is an actual person. It can't be an anonymous user. And then for authentication classes, I'm going to set this to token authentication. This is going to let it know that I need a token to be able to return a response. Now, if someone sends a request, they get a 401 unauthorized, and it tells them that the detail behind it is that the authentication credentials were not provided. So that's how I'm enforcing, saying, hey, I need these credentials in order for you to be able to ping this API call. So now when I click on my authorization header and I send my request, I get back user information. So now in my response, all I'm going to return will be request.user. That gives me my user model. And I can say email. And there it gives me back the user email for this one specific user matching the token. Does anyone have any questions over the info, API view, how it works, or what it's doing? All right, doesn't seem like there are any questions. So let's go over our last view, being able to log out a user. So let's say class log out, bring in the API view. And this is going to log out a user. Now, how exactly is this going to log out a user? It's going to need to authenticate a user, grabbing a token, and then it needs to trigger the logout function. So how can it do that? I'm going to go ahead and make sure that this gets a post request or a post method only. And I'm going to enforce my authentication. So I'm going to say, hey, in order for this class to be able to be accessed, you need to provide token authentication. And for permissions, I need you to also provide, or I need this to be an actual user, not just an anonymous user. Well, now when I send this post request, what is this going to do? How do I log out my user? Well, in order to log out the user, I need the logout function to get triggered first. So let's see what logout does. So logout just takes in a request, and that's it. It's going to go within the request, grab the user, and say, hey, this user has now logged out. Well, before I log out a user or just sign them out, I don't want them to have a valid token anymore. So I want to remove their token as well. So I'm going to say request.user, and I misspelled request, .auth token. If we remember, if I take a look at my token model one more time, I have a one-to-one relationship to the user where my related name is auth token. So if I need to access, or if I need to access my auth token through my user, I could do it like this. Let's print that out for now. Oh. Let me go ahead and return a response here for logout and plug this in so we can see it. Going to go back to my URLs, create a new path named logout. This will use the logout view as a view. And it will have the name of logout. All right. Let's go ahead and send our request. So users slash logout, and I want this to send a post method. All right, so we can see logout there. And if I go to my views, what's being printed here on my terminal is my token. The token that I actually passed in related to this user. Well, now I don't want this token to exist anymore. So I'm going to go ahead and delete my token by doing the .delete method. And then I'm going to log out my user by using logout and passing in the request. Finally, for my response, I'm just going to do status HTTP 204. All right, so now I'm going to send my request. We can see that it was successful. I got this HTTP 204. Good. If I go over to SQL and I do my search query one more time for this last individual, we have a couple of dates here. So here we have the date joined and we have our last logout. We can see my last logout was at 0843. It's currently 0859. So now if I try to send a request to info with the same authorization header, it's going to fail because I have an invalid token. This token no longer exists. So now let's go ahead and let me make sure that my body's still there. All right, my body is. Let's go ahead and try to register this user that already exists. Let's see what it will do. And let's remove this authorization here. Well, now if I send it, it tells me a user with that username already exists. And it tells me an email with that email already exists, or a user with that email already exists. All right, good. So that's working pretty well. Now let's go ahead and send our information to login. It gives me a new token with a completely new value. So I'm going to copy that, bring that in here, and now paste my new token. I am now going to include my authorization header, send a GET request to info, and it gives me my user email. And then finally, I can log out once again. All right. And just like that, we went over the CRUD methods. Well, not necessarily CRUD. You would have to create one for updating your user. But we've gone over how to register a new user and sign them in upon registration, utilizing the login function. We covered how to log in a new user, utilizing the login function and authenticate function. We've covered how to get a user's information. We covered how the token authentication class works, what is authenticated class is using, and how it's able to grab that request or grab that user from our request. And then we covered the logout function. Again, how we're able to delete a token through that related field name, log out the user itself, utilizing the request and the logout function, and return the appropriate responses for each one of our methods. At this point, does anyone have any questions over how we implemented token-based authentication? Go ahead, Edge.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about why in the logout class we use a post method to log out when you're using a delete method inside of there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So again, this isn't in reference, or these methods aren't being in reference to my my token, right? This isn't my token app. This is actually my user app. So I want to follow somewhat of API conventions as to what each one is doing. I'm using a post request to be able to create a user. I am again utilizing a post request. And in this post request here, I'm not actually creating a user, right? There is a token that may or may not be created, but that I don't necessarily care about the behavior that's happening with the token. This is what's happening to the user. So one could make the argument that this should be a put request, right? But what I'm actually posting is a new login entry into my into my database. So that's why we're still using post. Then we have our info, which we know that should be a get method. And for logout, yes, I am deleting a token, but what I care about is not actually what's happening to the token, but what's happening to the user. I'm not creating a new user. I'm just simply logging out said user. You could choose to do a different method, but the common convention is to utilize post requests for the kind of logout. Does that answer your question, Edge?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Of course. Go ahead, Natalie.
So you said with the login, it's like creating an entry in our database. The logout also has an entry in the database that says like last time logged out or something like that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So let's take a look here. I believe the last time that we looked at this, where is my logout? So here's my last login, which was a 0843. Right? If I run this again, well, now it's going to give me my updated login as 09. Now, if I did not utilize the logout function, it would just continue using the 0843. Logout just lets Django know, hey, this session or this one session while this user was in here is now over. If they sign in again, we need to update this information within the database and post a new login time. Does that answer your question, Natalie?
Yeah, so if I'm understanding correctly, the logout basically updates the last login for the time that they logged out.
Right. It says, hey, that is now over. The next time this person logs in, make a new entry. All right. Any other questions regarding anything we've covered so far? All right. Then, go ahead, Yams.
If a user signs in and then doesn't, if they log in and they don't log out, when they log in again, does it refresh their token? Does it make a new token again?
It will not make a new token because when they log in again, or let's say they're logging in on separate devices, we're utilizing this get or create function. So it won't generate a new token. It will just grab the same token that they had before within the database.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. Awesome. So now that we've gone over this information, we can see a bit of repeated code within logout and info. They both have these attributes and they're both API views. So let's utilize multiple inheritance here to clean up our information. So I'm going to make class, or let's say token required. So it's going to be my token required class, and it's going to be an API view. All I'm going to say is that this has authentication classes, which will be token authentication. And I also want permission classes, which will be is authenticated. Oh, hello. So now that these two attributes are set for this one class, I could just go ahead and utilize inheritance to pass down the token required class. And then remove that information. And everything is going to work exactly the same. If I go to login, I send my request. Let me take off this authorization header. I get a brand new token. Now that I have a brand new token, I can then send a GET request. So we can see that my GET request works. And then I can send a POST request to logout. And my logout has now been processed. And that's it. My entire user functionality is good to go. And I'm utilizing a little bit of OOP to be able to manage this information. Awesome. Well, now how do I handle for users? Or as earlier mentioned, this one user can essentially, especially since I'm just destructuring data, they could ask to be set as staff, right? So after I create this trainer object here, I want to make sure that I make a change here where I say new trainer dot is staff is equal to false. And then I'm going to save that. To make sure that regardless of what the user passes, they always get false for is staff. And let me make sure that that is all that we need there. Okay, so we have username, first name, last name is at staff. This is active is also going to change. So is active whenever they're logged in, you'll see it be true. And whenever they log out, or actually, let me make sure that that's correct here. Yes, so that's incorrect. So this is active field is what you'll change whenever you want to delete a user. You don't ever want to actually delete a user from your database. You want to keep their information just in case your user comes back. So if your user is inactive, you could set this to false, but that is okay to be set to true for now. So it looks like that's the only thing we're going to need to change. Let me make sure that the abstract user doesn't have something else in here, or the abstract base user. Is active. Nope. This looks good. All right. So there we go. We can change it in our views so that we can change that is staff to false as our default value. Well, now what about someone who we do want to have access to the admin site? All right. What if we have something like a master trainer that actually has the ability to create Pokemon and is able to do all of the CRUD authentication process that we want them to do? Well, then we would have to create a separate class for them. It's essentially going to utilize all of the same exact code. The only thing that we have to change is the trainer or this is staff function to be true. I don't want to copy and paste this entire information over and over again. So maybe there's a way to utilize OOP here to be able to grab this. Excuse me, everyone. Actually, we've been going on for quite a while. Let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break and then come back and finish off our lecture. I'll see everyone back here at 11:20. Thank you so much, everyone. All right, welcome back, everyone. The last thing we talked about was how to actually set or register a user. Well, in this case, what we want to do is set an actual user that we preferably want this to be in a separate API endpoint. And in this separate API endpoint, we want to keep this endpoint concealed, right? Because we wouldn't want everyone to just know how to access as our main administrators to have access to our admin site and direct access to all of our entire database. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new path here. And we could actually even set this as an environment variable if we wanted to. We could go ahead and say Pokemon project dot settings import env. And we could go over to env and set a new path here. And let's go ahead and say that this is master trainer and make that equal to master sign up with an ending slash. Right, this way we could keep it hidden from everyone else. No one knows how to sign up as our master trainer. We can go over to our URLs. This is still just Python, so we can create an f string that utilizes env.get. And then I could grab that one specific key, which is master trainer, and bring it in to my URLs for master trainer. So now we're able to go ahead and ping this API endpoint. It's completely secret. No one else is going to be able to use it. It won't be exposed during production either, because we could still set environment variables during production. And we know that this is working correctly, or at least we'll find out if this is working correctly here. And then we'll want to utilize a separate class. Let's say master trainer. And let's set this as a view. Name. I'm just going to put master in there. So now I don't currently have this view. I'm going to create it. I'm going to make a master trainer. Oh. So there we have our master trainer. And now I have my views. So now let's go ahead and create this view. Let's say class master trainer will be an API view. And what this class is going to do is it's going to take in a post request, self, and request. And now let's take a look at what would be common between both classes. All right, we would want to set all of this information. Maybe the last thing that I want to happen here is I want to set isStaff to false right before my login function. And then everything else can remain the same. Well, if everything else is remaining the same, then that seems like I'm utilizing some sort of repetitive functionality here. So let's actually create a global function here that's going to be named create user or return exception. And it looks like all this is going to need is going to be an argument of request. I'm going to try to copy most of this. This is all in theory. I'm not sure if this is actually going to work. We're going to try it out. Nope, 2.4. Let's bring in this request here. And this request is essentially going to watch that all of this happens. Nope. But the return values are going to be different. So I'm going to return a response here with the actual validation. Or let's go ahead and rather than returning a response, we're going to return the message dictionary. And same thing here, rather than returning this information, we're going to return the new trainer. Right? Token. Oh, I guess we would also have to return token in this case. So let's also return the token. Okay, so now this function is working exactly the same. I'm grabbing all of my information. I'm logging a user in, but I'm not setting this false. All right. So now if all of this works correctly, I will return either a list of my new trainer or the error for the message dictionary. All right. So now that I have this method working, what's wrong with the class? Oh, got it. So now that I have this function that's working, I may be able to reutilize this function here. So I can say return statement, or maybe I could say credentials or error. And I can make this equal to create user or return exception and pass it in the request. So then I can say if creds or error. I could maybe check the type of this. Is equal to a list. So if it is a list, then I would like to return this response here. But I need to grab new trainer and token, and in this case, I could just call it trainer. So then I could say trainer and token is equal to creds or error. So I'm destructuring that information to grab the trainer and token and then returning them. Else, or I don't even need an else statement in there. Otherwise, what I would want to return is my e.messageDict. But instead of that, I would just want to return. Let's do e here. Just so that we could reference it. Then what we would return would be creds or error message dictionary. Okay. So now the only difference that I would actually need is this new trainer.save should be set to true. All right. So now if everything goes according to plan, I should be able to ping this new trainer API endpoint here. And I should be able to just create a new user with the correct information with little to no repetitive code now. I guess my response is still being repetitive if I wanted to figure out a different method that could clean this up. But now at this point that I've made this would likely go into a utilities file. Before trying to change any of my other code, I'm going to make sure that this is working. So I'm going to go over to my Python server here. I'm going to run my requests. This .get master trainer doesn't seem to be working. It's saying unmatched parentheses. I wonder where that's coming from. Go ahead, Tom.
I think it might just be. Oh, my apologies. Never mind. It is there. Sweet.
Sean?
Yeah, I've seen this before. It's because of the quotes. You need to do the small quotes, the apostrophe quotes on the inside, or like the different quotes than what you have on the outside.
Oh, great. Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I I can't believe I didn't catch that. Thank you. That's embarrassing. All right, let's go ahead and try that out. All right, so it seems like everything is working. I'm able to hide my URL file. Let's go ahead and make sure that this goes to the correct endpoint. So this is going to go ahead and go over to master sign up. It's going to be a post request. It shouldn't have any authorization headers. And my body, let's just go ahead and do master@gmail.com. And let's see what our views does. Well, now if I send this request, okay, the request was processed successfully, and I get back, and I get back the correct response. So I can see that the trainer and the token have now been made. And my trainer is a staff. Well, now I could refactor the code down here to match what I have right up here. So I could essentially copy this information, come down here, and paste it for my return method. With the only difference being that rather than setting isStaff to true, I want to set isStaff to false. All right, so now I did a little bit of refactoring. I'm able to create a master trainer. And now if I open up the admin site, I can go ahead and say Django admin. I go over to the admin site, I pass in master@gmail.com, and I go over and I pass in FR. Site administrator, you don't have permissions to view, edit anything. Okay, awesome. So at least we were able to get into this site itself, so we can see that that worked. But there is one more attribute that we have not changed to be able to make this successful. Well, we also need to set the isStaff to true, and we need to set that my trainer dot is super user is also true. So there we have our isStaff, our is super user. Here we're going to go ahead and say trainer dot is super user false. There's definitely, I could already see a lot of repetitive code again, so there's definitely more refactoring that can be done in these two methods. Let's run master2 and send this request now. Okay, the request comes back. I'm gonna log out, log in again. Let's run master2 at gmail.com and run FR. And now if I log in, I have my tokens built in there. I have my groups for authentication and authorization, my moves, and Pokemon, because I am a super user that is able to manage all of the information within my application. All right, and that covers how we can create super users, how we can create users, log in, log out, and get the information of independent users, all while utilizing token-based authentication. At this point, does anyone have any questions over what we just covered during the last 20 minutes? All right. It doesn't seem like there are any questions. So let's do a quick overview here. Today, we went over the different types of authentication, which there were basic, session, and token-based authentications. We covered creating a user model. We utilized the abstract user model to go ahead and utilize inheritance and overwrite some of those attributes. We dropped the database and recreated our database due to that admin dependency on our user model. So moving forward, please create your user model first thing before you make any migrations or try to migrate anything into your database. Then we implemented Django REST framework token-based authentication by setting our authentication default classes within our settings.py and creating a one-to-one relationship to all of our independent users. We then created a view for registering a new user, logging in a user, logging out a user, and getting the info of a user. And lastly, we covered how to handle a super user within our Django REST framework. And at this point, we have a fully CRUD API for Pokemon that we can update all of the information within our Pokemon, delete all of our Pokemon, and read all of our Pokemon. We can also create Pokemon, and if you went ahead, you can also create the same behavior for moves. You could restrict those views if you would like that, utilizing the token-based authentication classes, and now you also have token-based authentication within your user application. At this point, does anyone have any questions over anything that we covered today? All right, if no one has any questions, that's going to conclude our lecture. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.